A warm welcome to you, David Lewin. David Lewin is teaches at the Department of Educational Studies at the Liverpool Hope University. Broadly, his research work is in the area of pedagogical and theological implications of technology. And he also researches on ethics of education and interested deeply in this area of philosophy of education with focus on ethics. The paper is titled Humanizing Online Pedagogy, Technology, Attention and Education. I think at a point in time when all the, across the world, when higher education is at a critical juncture where many other factors are impinging, massification responses, time and resource constraints, as well as the thrust and movement towards larger economic aims of education, along with technology, online, and alternative spaces that is being explored. I think David Lewin's paper is going to help us pause and caution the way forward. Thank you, Lewin. Over to you for 35 minutes.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you indeed to the organisers of the conference. It's, of course, a real pleasure and privilege to be here today and to be able to talk to you about this topic, which is indeed something that's becoming more and more a part of our lives, technology, and in terms of education, part of how we perhaps engage or disengage students, first and foremost with PowerPoint. And I'm always unsure whether to use these technological supports, but today I'm going to give a few slides to support what I'm saying. So I just wanted to give you a sort of sense of the overall paper, really. And I'm working in the intersections of philosophy of technology, philosophy of religion, and philosophy of education. So it's quite interdisciplinary. And I'm particularly interested in something that Krasima was talking about, Biesta's concept of learnification. So you've already got a way into that. And I want to look at that in reference to e-learning and see whether indeed e-learning encourages that kind of process. Then I want to move on to a French philosopher, Bernard Stiegler, to consider whether his concept of tertiary memory and in particular just the ambivalence of technology that he wants to talk about. I want to get away from thinking of technology either first of all in neutral terms, that's definitely what I don't want to do, or indeed in sort of simply praising technology as something that's facilitating, or indeed suggesting that technology is eroding and dangerous to culture, education and attention. So I want to use the concept of Stiegler of the pharmacon of technics to explore that idea and his idea of the threat to critical consciousness. Finally, I'm going to move on to an idea which is quite speculative, which brings in a bit of philosophy of religion, and I've called that time and space are out of joint. So in that area, I'm using a little bit of Mercy Eliade and Jonathan Zed Smith to talk about time and space, or particularly space, and how spatiality and temporality are ultimately disrupted through certain kinds of activity, ritual activities, that ultimately serve attention, and how that relates to technology, I hope becomes clear. So this is one of our mottos, not mottos, documents really, at our institution, our approach to higher education, Liverpool Hope University. And I wanted to just highlight this. For me, when I read this, I was quite uncomfortable with it. I think that discomfort is shared perhaps with some people I've spoken to in the conference so far. I'm uncomfortable in different ways, and there may be some of you that are very, very sympathetic to the suggestion and the undertone here. So I just want to say, or read through some of the underlying parts. We seek to enhance a real, not a virtual community. We are not a university where academic staff turn up only to deliver lectures or to perform timetable duties, or where educational technology substitutes for actual and authentic personal engagement. Behind this, I've sensed in the institution an unhelpful polarization then between authenticity and technology. And so that's one of the themes I'm really interested in. So in a world where more and more higher education institutions are seeking opportunities to offer courses to a global market of online learners, this commitment to the physical habitat of education might seem somewhat obsolete or anachronistic. Yet many educators speak for the uncanny quality of physical presence, that being physically face-to-face with students has a singular, irreducible pedagogical power. This raises a question: is the interest in online education really pedagogical? I would argue that the impetus to develop online education is founded first and foremost on economic rather than pedagogic concerns. So my general orientation here then is critical. There are no doubt intrinsic benefits to online education, or at least some, perhaps confidence, perhaps overcoming certain social, practical restrictions and so on. But where resources of time and money are unrestricted, isn't the educational encounter best in person? Of course, time and money are never unrestricted, and only disengaged speculations about some utopian future would seriously entertain such a scenario. And so perhaps we ought to accept that the prime interest of the online education industry is and needs to be the efficiencies that can be harnessed through the reconfiguring, if not the full overcoming, of space and time. The concerns about online education expressed here do not justify a wholesale rejection of online life. So despite this critical orientation, I want to explore some ways in which technologies and virtual worlds occupy a grey area in educational theory and practice. An ambiguity arises when we see technologies are neither simply the neutral means to ends determined by human beings, nor, in opposition to this, artificial intrusions on a pure state of nature. So moving on to online learning or e-learning. Online education, is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon and can hardly be defined in straightforward terms. We might first wonder whether online education is equivalent to online learning or e-learning, terms which Wikipedia, to take an example, presents as synonymous. This is an important question for philosophers of education because education as a substantive and multifaceted phenomenon can be distinguished from learning in important ways, as Biesta has shown in his critical analysis of the learnification of education. For Biesta, this shift in our language from education to learning is related to the fact that we have lost sight of questions of educational purpose and value. E-learning does have some of the characteristics that Biesta identifies with the shift towards the language of learning. E-learning is more consumer-driven in the sense that it tries more than ever to adapt to the needs and contexts of learners. This can be observed in the spatio-temporal flexibility of online education. It can take place synchronously in real time, so to speak, or asynchronously, whenever suits the learner, i.e. self-paced. Though the asynchronous component is more characteristic of learning online, where learners engage in email, blogs, forums, wikis, and so forth. This flexibility can facilitate independence of mind and self-directed attitudes towards education, but more negatively plays into the student as consumer attitude. E-learning also tends to be individualistic, often replacing classroom experiences with structured activities that can be tutor-led, but are typically self-directed, emphasizing learning as a process about, and often only about, the learner who acquires knowledge, understanding, or skills. Despite his critical analysis of the shift to a culture of learning, Biesta acknowledges that these features of learning, and by implication e-learning, have some emancipatory potential. The shift reflects deep historical currents that see a less centralized and less authoritarian view of education, in which the student is understood as co-constructor of their own understandings of the world. However, Biester argues that the language of learning does not just reflect a more democratic or inclusive form of pedagogy in which the learner is placed centre stage. On the contrary, the learnification culture is threatening to democratic and inclusive ways of being because it reduces democratic processes to the aggregation of individual desires. To service aggregated desires does not bring into question the ground and context of those desires. Moreover, the learning culture does not foster reflection upon the purposes of education, but rather takes those for granted that purposes basically equate to what individuals want them to be. In other words, they are regarded as preferences, as givens. Of course, this is thoroughly individualistic, but Biester is hinting here at a more fundamental problem, that education, properly understood, points to a shared cultural enterprise which is lost in the culture of learnification. This point is really calling for a radical reorientation of our hollowed-out culture of learning, since it reintroduces ontology into education. That education has an orientation to something real, and that individual desires must, in some sense, be in dialogue with that reality, both informing it and being informed by it. So, an important question emerges from this. What does online education, learning online, do to this transformation of education to learning? Does it reinforce and extend the shift from education to learning? Does it limit and reorganize our relationship to the purposes of education? Are we indeed at liberty to pursue and define our own purpose as consumers? One answer to this question would be to say that online education contributes to a culture of individualized and consumerist learning that suppresses the examination of purposes. Online learning reinforces the impression that students are able to select a good product in advance. I do believe there's some credibility to such an analysis, but I don't want to leave it there because it doesn't treat technology in sufficiently ambivalent terms, which is what I'm trying to do today. And it does indeed encourage a more sentimental and unrealistic rejection of our technological being. In other words, there needs to be a way in which online education can express and shape reflection on the purposes of education in a substantive and meaningful way without polarizing the virtual and the physical, or indeed the natural and the artificial, which is a common dualism. I now turn to the idea of the philosopher Bernhard Stiegler, who understands digital technology and modern media as pharmacological, both poisonous and curative. Stiegler rejects the assumption that the human could exist prior to the technical, arguing that the evolution of human reflective awareness was concurrent with what he calls technics. Indeed, for Stiegler, there is no human being without technics. Despite this, he is very critical of the impact of modern technology and media on education and the youth in particular. Yet Stiegler's analysis is interestingly ambivalent, coming out of a reading of critical theories of technology, in particular Heidegger, but radically departing from them by his view that technics is coeval with hominization. Stiegler's work is generally not well known by educationalists, so I just want to develop an account of his thinking on memory and attention that will bring us to examine some of his ideas which are particularly relevant to education. So, the role of tertiary memory in education. Memory is the foundation of culture. The ancient Greeks mythologized this insight with the story of the goddess Mnemosyne, daughter of Gaia and Uranus, and mother, through union with Zeus, of the 9 muses. Through Mnemosyne, poetry and the arts more generally are made present. Without memory, then, culture could not exist. For Stiegler, the shared mnemonic heritage that is culture is passed on through what he calls technical exteriorization. Exteriorizations rely upon forms of prosthesis, which might take prehistoric forms, such as flint tools and wax tablets, or can appear in the more modern guises of books, magazines, forms of digital media databases, and so forth. Such prostheses are forms of tertiary memory, since they are distinct from primary and secondary forms, namely genetic inheritance, primary memory through genetic inheritance, and secondary memory through individual awareness and experience. So while genes we can't control, memories die with us. Those are the primary and secondary forms of memory. So in tertiary memory then, experience can be liberated from genetic determinism or individual loss, enabling humanity to pass on cultural inheritance. In prehistoric times, cultural transmissions would have been slow and fitful. Particularly from the 18th and 19th century, this transmission is driven by and appropriated by a more industrious and methodical spirit. Stiegler argues that the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, with the perception of science as fundamentally progressive, inspired a new sense of the significance of history and of temporality and the passage of time. And there's a Hegelian, an important Hegelian connection, of course. The realization of culture through memory is only possible through the development of technology as the material supports of tertiary memory. The techniques that support tertiary memory constitute an awareness of time that entails the possibility of retention, looking backwards, and protension, looking forwards, which are Husserlian terms that Stiegler's using. In other words, the stitching together of temporality, of past and future, and the emergence of techniques are one and the same event. It is here that we see techniques as a key aspect of hominization. For Stiegler, the history of philosophy has suppressed the recognition of the role of techniques in the process of hominization. And we have the concept of the noble savage, the Rousseauian, or all over the place, this idea of pure human nature and a return to nature, otherwise from technology. So the next section is called the Pharmacon of Technics. History, as the story of culture, is generally defined by its constitution through one particular form of technology, which Stiegler is particularly interested in, namely writing. Where written accounts exist, we have entered history. But this birth of history is marked by ambiguity, an undecidable that Derrida calls the pharmacon of writing. For Derrida, the dual, the undecidable nature of the pharmacon undercuts the binary logic that structures Western thought. It is not a matter of deciding whether writing reveals or conceals, it does both simultaneously. But doesn't this binary logic structure contemporary discussions about whether technology is an educational force for good or a bad influence on the youth, or indeed on each other and our attention? We might want to avoid talking about technology in a general and abstracted sense, a sense that is sometimes called essentialist, by arguing that each particular technical device has some educational potential and some dangers. There's a whole literature on this problem of technological essentialism, which I'm not going to go into. But Derrida, though, for Derrida, though, this response would point to complexity, but not undecidability. Undecidability being an intrinsic and irreducible quality of ambiguity. Furthermore, I would argue that it is quite clear that technologies have something undecidable about them. Technology is both what puts power in our hands, while simultaneously threatening to erode that power by making us blind to the scope and significance of our own actions. As Gunther Anders, speaking of atomic energy in the 1950s, put it, this is a quote, as engineers, at least as engineers of nuclear weapons, we have become omnipotent, an expression that is little more than metaphor. But as intellectual beings, we do not measure up to this omnipotence of ours. By way of technology, we can no longer conceive what we can produce and do. We can no longer conceive what we can produce and do. Technology both makes us smarter then and more stupid, more engaged and more disengaged, more potent and more powerless. Online environments feel much the same. They simultaneously present and hide the world or worlds. Drawing on Heidegger's critique of technology, Albert Borgman makes the point that the characteristic feature of technology, which he defines as an ability to make things available to us in unprecedented ways, availability is his word, that availability is marked by an erosion of the significance of things. In other words, the more things are available to us, I think I've missed my slide. No. The more things are available to us, the less significance things have for us. Don't know if this is your experience. It's a little bit my experience. The more film and music become on demand, available, 24/7, I think is the phrase, the less committed and my listening and viewing becomes. We see with MOOCs, the massive open online courses, which are so popular right now, we see with those an extraordinarily enthusiastic take-up, which doesn't translate into quite such extraordinary completion rates, or indeed transformative experiences of education. I'm not sure. Not to say they're not incredible, striking changes. Borgman defines technological availability as what is rendered, quote, instantaneous, ubiquitous, safe, and easy. That's what good technology should be all about. There are problems with this definition. For example, the digital divide between those who do and do not have access to digital technologies raises questions about ubiquity. The use of technology in abuse or issues of online privacy makes safety a questionable feature of availability. Many other problems we could go into. Despite these problems, the definition does provide some insight into the way in which the world is made available, more available through digital devices. This definition of technical availability might well be applied to online environments and extended to online learning specifically, at least where they work reasonably well. But does this availability carry with it an uncanny disengagement with the substance of learning, as Borgman might suggest? This is a question that we need to at least be able to ask, and I suggest in the current culture climate of our relation to technology, we don't really even ask the question. We assume that things are delivered, made available without wondering if there's something else going on. Do we not often mistake the content or process of education for education itself? In a similar sense, doesn't online education presuppose an educational model as little more than the transmission of knowledge, Freire's banking model, for example? Is online learning not fundamentally reductive? Isn't education irreducibly founded on contact and relation between teacher and student, a relation that cannot fully exist in an online world? It would be tempting to argue this. It would be tempting to reject technology as King Tharmas rejects the offer of writing in order to remain in a natural state of immediacy with nature, where our faculties can be employed in a fully human way. I'm sure you all know King Tharmas, the Egyptian king who's offered the gift of writing in Plato's Phaedrus and rejects the offer because it will erode memory. Even if we wanted to make such a rejection of technology, we could not do so if technology is part of who we are. As Stiegler argues, the history of technogenesis is the history of anthropogenesis. From this point of view, the problem of how to humanize online education might seem predicated on a false assumption, namely that online is basically inhuman, unreal, absent, disconnected, and disengaged. But the recognition that technology is central to human identity does not mean that we uncritically embrace all that we call technology as the affirmation of human creativity. Technology is the invention of writing, or the splitting of the atom is the pharmacon. And really it's the discourse, the prevailing discourse that is so polarized and I think makes us unable to consider the threats in a reflective way. So in his recent work, Stiegler has shifted his emphasis from technics to the related question of attention. I'm just going to have to sort of go very quickly through this. There is a clear connection to memory here, which I hope becomes evident. In some respects, Stiegler's analysis is a rather hackneyed neo-Frankfurtian attack on the danger of a manipulative culture industry determined to commodify, colonize, and corrode the attention of the youth. New media tech, and we've heard it about books, we've heard it about TV. You know, every form of media has a phase of reaction. New media technologies are increasingly effective at manipulating attention, and so the emergence of the new science of attention economics is both inevitable and perhaps alarming. With the proliferation of each new form of media, newspapers, pulp paperbacks, movies, TV, and the internet and social media, emerges new worries about the creation of the next generation of what Stiegler calls "I don't give a dammers." In this vein, Stiegler draws on Catherine Hales' view that our media-rich environment is eroding our capacity for what she calls deep attention, particularly in the youth. Deep attention is here being replaced by what Hales calls hyperattention. Hyperattention characterized by switching focus rapidly between different tasks, preferring multiple information streams, seeking a high level of stimulation. I'm sure if you've checked your phone in the last 5 minutes, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm watching. Indeed, Stiegler argues that the very distinction between adults and the youth is being unhelpfully confused, whereby the critical maturity of adulthood is stunted or even entirely arrested. There's a big section about what's happening in the relationship between youth and adult culture in France in particular. Stiegler is also keen to acknowledge the insights from brain imaging, which depict the adaptation, where the brain's adapting to its environment in the early years of life and throughout life, to establish the shifting scene of the brain by exploring synaptogenesis. This is alarming, Stiegler, since not only are we weakening our attentional capacity, but we are also in danger of irretrievably losing our intellectual maturity. So I want to share a quote with you now from a critic of Stiegler. Pointing to the contradictions at the centre of Stiegler's project, Richard Iveson has said the following. It's on the slide. Proclaiming himself thus a prophet of and from potentially the last generation of mature adults, Stiegler seeks to hastily recall us to rational critique before the new media has its way and irretrievably restructures the connections which constitute intelligence, so as to render such constitution impossible. For Stiegler, the effect of new media is, in a nutshell, the destruction of that hard-won product of Kant's Aufklärung, critical consciousness. What is somewhat ironic in all of this, in all of Stiegler's account of the erosion of our critical consciousness, is its acknowledgement, on the one hand, of the pharmacological nature of technological development, but then its reliance on a conventional, even banal, critique of modern technology and new media as the manipulation and erosion of attention and critical consciousness. This is important and illustrates some deeply held assumptions about attention itself. For example, that attention exists prior to culture engaging with it. An attentional foundationalism, I would call it in philosophical terms. And there's a bit of psychology here, which I'm not by any means an expert on. Common among psychologists is the view that attention is akin to a spotlight that the subject can point towards objects. But this view of attention suggests that the spotlight itself does not alter what it points towards, but only illuminates it. It is simply a neutral faculty or tool. There are many problems with this view of attention as a neutral tool. For one, it disregards the historical constitution of attention, as if attention exists as an Archimedean point or a Cartesian foundation, and that when we attend, we can see the world afresh, seeming to invite a kind of naive realism. It also tends to ignore how attention is related to and affected by its object. If we consider with Stiegler that attention is affected by its object, then the ways in which different media form and shape attention become significant. The question of online learning can then be seen in terms of the ways in which technologies form attention, rather than supposing that attention is a fixed and natural faculty that is either enhanced or diminished by our ever-developing technological milieu. We do not, then, need to begin our debate with questions like, how do we stop the internet destroying our attention span? Susan Greenfield, Professor of Pharmacology at Oxford University, has raised some concerns which sound a bit like Stiegler about the dangers of growing up in an online environment or a world online, and how this changes our intellectual and attentional capacities. She says, this is a quote, "Whilst, of course, internet use doesn't threaten the existence of the planets like climate change, I think the quality of our existence is threatened, and the kind of people we might be in the future." Greenfield here is expressing a fairly conventional concern about the erosion of deep attention that Hales says is needed for complex problem solving and sustained understanding. In the educational world in particular, deep attention is regarded as normative, while hyperattention, useful though it may be in certain commercial contexts, from air traffic control to currency trading, is connected to the loss of some essential aspect of human identity. But Hale suggests that the two forms of attention can be brought together. She says, quote, "Stimulation by media, if it is structured appropriately, can actually contribute to a synergic combination of hyperattention and deep attention, which could have interesting implications for pedagogy." Stiegler, on the other hand, is not so optimistic about this synergy. As we move from what Stiegler characterizes or refers to as the Republic of Letters, the 17th, 18th century Enlightenment debate between Europe and North America, to an age of numeric programming, a contrast which itself evokes the kind of binary logic that doesn't abide this undecidability that I want to talk about. We must, I think, be extremely alert to the dangers that Hales, Stiegler and others draw attention to. We can be sympathetic to Stiegler's concerns about the threats to critical consciousness without seeing online life as heralding the destruction of the literate world, which is kind of where he's going. Kind of. There is furthermore a strongly political dimension to Stiegler's concerns, which I'd like to explore, but I'll just briefly mention. For Stiegler, modern media not only replaces deep attention with hyperattention, but also desire, which should be shaped in dialogue with the community, at least in the sense of a deliberative democratic process akin to what Catherine Elgin was talking about. So desire needs the dialogue with the community and becomes decomposed into constituent and individualized drives. So drives replace desire. Those drives become the individual preferences of the consumer that in some conceptions of democracy are a given commitment to be mediated by a politics of representation. So we can see here a correlation with Biester's analysis of the consumerist attitude to learning, in which individual preferences are the start and the end of the examination of purposes in education. So now come to this sort of almost conclusion. I'm calling this section Time and Space are out of joint. You've got the cosmos. Of course, you can't see God, which is appropriate. I thought, I've just slapped the image in, and that's how it came out, so I thought that's appropriate. Where am I when I am online? When online, vast educational resources are available to me in a de-distanced availability, and that's kind of Heidegger's language, de-distancing, sorry. I have already suggested that Borgman would understand this availability as the erosion of significance, but can we clarify the nature of what is lost? If online education overcomes spatio-temporal situatedness, does it also undo some essential qualitative dimension of spatio-temporality? Perhaps philosophy of religion can help us here. Mircea Eliade distinguished between sacred and profane with particular reference to the nature of time and space. For Eliade, the significance of human life can be found through the structuring and delineating of space and time. The capacity of hierophany, the phenomena of God coming into the world, of God who is wholly other, That phenomena exists where space and time are consecrated through the paradigmatic rituals of religious traditions. Rituals allow for the world to be formed from chaos to cosmos, as they bind us to certain times and places which are ordered and sanctified. From the Sabbath to the Mass, specific rituals, you could put any other ritual there, rituals allow for a vertical interruption of the profane. In Eliada's view, myths and rituals provide structure and orientation to the world that would inhibit and disrupt the total availability of life online. Such inhibition and disruption of the normal patterns are where significance itself comes from, since these interruptions are characterized by their otherness. They cannot be circumscribed within the projections of the subject. I want to leave open space for a secular reading of this, by the way. For example, attending the cathedral evensong, oriented to the altar, hearing the choristers, that theoretically could be streamed direct to your phone, or you can watch it Christmas Eve if you're into that sort of thing. This opens a space for contingency, a place of encounter and otherness that is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve online. This is because life online tends to be circumscribed by the determinations of the controlling subject or the programming that runs on devices. This could have relevance to online education, since it argues that for the irreducible significance of the physical encounter. This encounter is significant because the subject must relinquish control. Eliada's ideas only take us so far, and I want to use Jonathan Zed Smith, who's taken them a bit further. Smith takes up, but also departs from Eliada, where he says, this is a quote, ritual is, first and foremost, a mode of paying attention. It is a process of marking interest. It is this characteristic as well that explains the role of place as a fundamental component of ritual. Place directs attention. In brief, Smith's innovation of Eliada is the priority he gives to attention as the key component of presence and significance. Attention is the core dimension of ritual, an attention that for Eliada entailed the specificity of sanctified time and space. For Eliada, the singular times and spaces are given, whether from God, tradition, what have you, and so are not easily translated into the virtual. For Smith, on the other hand, space is sanctified by virtue of the act of attention, and could therefore conceivably take place in the mind, online. This is conceivable because the real goal of the disruptive encounter with the other must be the attention to the other. The significance of being disrupted is to see again with attention, so that the subjective projections are put to one side. Just a few concluding comments. The path we have taken has sketched out some of the relations between technology, time, attention, and life online. Smith's development of Eliada has given us a way of redirecting our attention from the physical to the attentional, thus avoiding a crude opposition between the physical and virtual. For Stiegler, attention and temporality are fundamentally related, since the formation of attention is coeval with tertiary retentions available to us through technological innovations. And it is those tertiary retentions that constitute our experience of temporality. Thus, authentic temporality and life online are not in principle mutually exclusive, though Stiegler, as we noted, explores the risks to our critical consciousness in relation to modern digital media. Elsewhere, Stiegler has been keen to show the virtual to be simply a new form of an ongoing process of humanization, where we might be more, I was going to say, optimistic. And here's a quote from Stiegler. Rather than talking about virtual space, one would have to refer to a new digital retentional system, a system which affects institutions of space and time, and which is no more and no less virtual than any other form of tertiary retention, equally involving space and time, calendarity and cardinality. In principle, then, online life is not different fundamentally from other forms of tertiary retention. We also considered Biesta's concerns about the culture of learnification and asked whether online education would reinforce and extend the pervasive and corrosive language of learning. I argued that online education does reinforce some aspects of learnification, but suggested it doesn't need to. And that's why I paired a discussion of Biesta with an ambivalent reading of technology and modern media. It is within the disruptive draft of the felt technological ambivalence. I want us to feel this ambivalence, that the question of significance and purpose are more likely to have traction and could therefore resist the mindlessness of learnification. The times and places of face-to-face education can work to structure time and space in ways that are disruptive. Those who want to be educated should not assume that education can come to them anytime, any place, anywhere, as the old slogan used to be, for a martini, I think it was. Like good parenting, the role of structuring space and time, of drawing lines and limits to where and when good education can take place, is an important part of the job of educational institutions. It is the role of the institution to offer the structure and support that is not infinitely flexible or able to meet the whimsical preferences of the student as consumer. This is pharmacological insofar as it both structures and inhibits. The disruptive nature of specific times and places can enable attention that is significant, but along with Smith and Stiegler, I suggest that it is not the specificity of the time or the place that is the point. It is the power to disrupt, to bring about fresh attention. And if Biesta is right that modern educational theory neglects reflection on the purposes of education, then this disruptive moment and the subsequent attention it provokes might offer a challenge to the view of education as conforming to subjective will and of the student as consumer. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Lewin. I think that was a wonderful exposition where you began to navigate and to understand not to dichotomize the physical and virtual learning and moving towards using Biesta's and Stigler's expositions. Thank you so much, and I think I'll leave it open now for the discussion for the next 15 minutes. Yes, between 10 and 15 minutes. Maybe a set of few questions since we have another presentation. Yes, here, and then next hand there. Here, this is the third row, please.
Hello. Hi. Thanks for your presentation, and please correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, but I feel that we're still viewing this whole phenomenon of online education from the lens of the traditional brick and mortar style of education. I say this because, contrary to your position that it's driven mostly by economics and less of a pedagogical importance, I would insist that there is a difference in online education when it comes to pedagogy. Because the role of the teacher changes here. Earlier, while the teacher was someone who was imparting a body of knowledge to the student, here the teacher becomes sort of like a curator of information and media. And like you mentioned, we are living in a world where we are being constantly bombarded by information and media from all places. And a teacher in such a scenario becomes a person who's putting it all together. So even the point about the dismal completion rates of the MOOCs, I would say the students are not in it for the sake of completing the course or, for the sake of getting that degree at the end of that course. For instance, if I take a Coursera course, I am taking it because I know that's a place where I'm going to get a curated information. I know for a fact that everything that I'm looking there, everything that I'm going to get there is already available on the internet, but I'm going there being aware of the fact that somebody has curated it, and hence it's different from just seeking information from the internet. So I would like to comment. I would like you to comment on this. Thank you.
We can take one more question.
Okay.
Yeah, the last. Yes.
Very nice presentation, but still, I mean, online learning is something we are just beginning to make sense of. Still, like, since we are so used to face-to-face interaction, and of course there's no substitute to physical presence and body language and expression and communication and so on, one agrees, and there's no fight with that. But on the other hand, even traditional pedagogies of mostly have worked under huge assumptions of learner attention, learner motivation, learner interest. If in this hall you are speaking, out of suppose 200 people, you really with no sense of confidence can you say that whether the attention is 10%, 20%, 30 or 40 or 50 or whatever. So without making those assumptions, the traditional, with those assumptions, traditional education has gone on. And online, as we know, puts really onus on the interested learner, in the hands of the interested learner. So what do you say to that?
Would you like to answer these two questions?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your questions. I detect a connection in the two questions, and it's to do, well, I mean, obviously there's a bigger question to do with what is the nature of teaching generally, and what is it indeed sort of delivering information and imparting knowledge, and or to what extent that is the sort of prime role of a face-to-face encounter or indeed an online encounter, and isn't a large part of what education is about, as you put it, curating, as providing some kind of relationship to knowledge and mediation. And I'm not at all unsympathetic to your point, that, but I do think that the face-to-face experience, at its best, isn't about primarily this imparting, and I kind of think of re-understanding education, perhaps again reading from Biest and Rancière, as the role of education being more a support and a focus and an opportunity to come together. And so there is a role for physical presence in that, and an intrinsic quality of presence which holds in a seminar experience, which isn't something directed necessarily, certainly not directly or primarily by the teacher. So, where is agency in education more broadly is a complicated question, and I think it raises, we've already noted that the fact that someone can Google the facts makes the agency within technology different. We ask different questions perhaps about where agency lies in technology, so in education. So I am sympathetic to what you're saying. So, but I think it's what you're getting at is a broader issue to do with what education itself means. And I suppose these changes that we're noticing should offer us reflection on the actual nature of education, and at its best it does. Which, going to the second question, the fact that even when I'm in a room, no one's listening anyway. So what difference does it make? There's no corrosion of attention because students aren't paying attention whether they're there or not. Again, this is a broader pedagogical issue, isn't it? It's to do with what we think we're doing when we're teaching face-to-face or indeed online. And, I'm not going to pretend that most education is engaging the attention, is using the encounter with the other in the kinds of disruptive possibility that's not the norm, but it is the possibility. And it's always that door that is open within a face-to-face encounter, more so, I suspect, than online. Although I'm wanting to suggest that can we find that kind of capacity for an encounter in a face-to-face or indeed online? I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, we have 1, 2, and 3 questions. We take 3 questions and we close this session. Yeah.
Okay, I'll have I think this is a criticism of Biesta, not of you, but I've welcomed the change, the shift from the language of education to the language of learning. And I just don't see it the way that he sees it at all. Education is ambiguous between making learning happen and displaying your knowledge. And lots of my colleagues think of what they do as displaying their knowledge, and I want to change that. I want people to think about making learning happen. And so I've never even thought about it the way that Biesta describes it. The second comment is just about how we should think about online. How we should think about online depends on what we think it's replacing, right? So I'm going to walk into a class on Tuesday. Next Tuesday of 180 students, and I will try and make them do things. But the truth is that I don't know what I achieve with that. If it's replacing sitting in a room with 25 students, then yeah, I think that there's bound to be a loss. But the Coursera course these Coursera courses, they're not replacing anything. They're just supplementing. They're sort of an addition to everything. And a lot of what can be done with online, anyway, and the technology has to be in service of our ends, not determining our ends. It can enable conversations to be happening that otherwise just wouldn't happen, right? If you supplement your in-person class with online fora, there's all sorts of things that can happen that just no way they would have happened otherwise. Of course, they could have happened otherwise, but they wouldn't have done. So.
Second question and the last question. Can you be just precise and short?
Yeah, I'll try to. Actually, I have as we already, you have already mentioned about pedagogy, I guess there are a lot of other multiple issues which are considered when you think about online education. So one could be accessibility in third world countries, other could be moral education, nation building, then again environmental issues are already there, like carbon footprints and all those things. Sustainability of this particular educational medium, it's itself again a question. So even if I decide to keep all these issues aside, I do have one question, if we think about specifically about MOOCs, I think choices itself is again a bigger issue here, because MOOCs always provide popular knowledge a priority. Just to give an example, if you go and search for the different courses available for languages, you would find that English, French, Japanese and Chinese, these could be the 4 or 5 languages which are given priority. If we go to some other technical things, then Android or mobile technologies could be given the priorities. But I don't think in near future you can see Ayurveda, Unani medicine, Sanskrit as coming as online courses somewhere. So basically choices will be provided only on the popular thing and not which is really good or which is really having a substance in it. So that is one question I have for you. The other is...
Hold that question. We'll hear
okay.
This question.
Yeah, sure.
This is more in the nature of an appreciative comment, sort of prompted also by the reactions about online technology and its pedagogical implications. I mean, I just wanted to say that I really appreciate this talk and having introduced, I think, certain important notions which must mediate the way we think about our online experience. The notion of temporality and the notion also deriving from philosophers like Heidegger of how the object or the thing, as he says, has a way of coming into presence, which includes also the coming into presence of our memories and the past, as well as of future possibilities. And I think it's quite right to say that by and large our online experience is not of this sort, but it's of the experience of links, if you like, rather than of links. You click on links rather than experience things in themselves. And so allowing for that way of presencing that Heidegger calls attention to. I think that perhaps to make it more relevant pedagogically, it would be important to add some things, some kinds of analysis. I think the analysis of the experience of temporality itself, the way in which time is structured through our pedagogies, through our school timetables, through our school assignments, and what kind of, so time is never left empty. You always are filling up time. Boredom, for instance, there's no place for boredom. There's no way of experiencing time itself as something which allows the presencing of things and objects. I think this might add to the sorts of analysis you're doing. The other kinds of analysis, I think, which would be is, things like social media. So what is our nature of being with others? What is the way in which we are with others? Someone talked about the materiality of the presence of the other. I think these kinds of analysis could be added, and I think they would have really important and deep implications for pedagogy.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. I'll go to as they were given. I'll answer. The critique of education, of learnification and Biesta is something in a way that, well, I mean, Biesta himself is quite upfront about some of the virtues of the shift to learning in terms of agency, in terms of inclusivity and so forth. I think it's hard to put in a nutshell. I'm going to put it in a nutshell, but I feel awkward about it. And it's to do with what I tried to get at, that there's an orientation, there's an ontological orientation in education, which Biesta is getting at here, which I don't think is easy to say in the present context of where we are at culturally, I think. That education should be oriented to something, and that the thing is what education is oriented to, and that as a group of students and a tutor, we gather around something. So a Shakespeare play, we speak the play, and the play is present, and it's something that's actual, and that probably sounds very liberal education-y, which I don't mean it to be. But anyway, so there's an ontological orientation that I think Biesta's getting at, and I'm sympathetic to that. I agree with the idea certainly agree that what we have through MOOCs or other emerging forms of education online are new. They're not replacements of, the traditional. I mean, when television was invented, they sort of set up a theatre stage, and they had a camera, and they did a play to camera, and that would have been what television was. So the form of previous technologies structure and frame how we think about new technologies, and obviously, therefore, the scope and possibility of new technology is hard to see. And I'm sure that's true about the internet today. We don't really yet see what it can do, and I mean that positively and negatively. So what I'm calling for really is a more hermeneutic of suspicion, you might say. Yeah. So the question at the back, yeah, I do agree that as more choices become available through MOOCs, and this is the evolution of any technology, it will find its place in, as it were, a structure which makes sense. And I think you're right that there are certain forms. If I heard the question correctly, I agree that again that many types of online encounter simply won't work. I mean, there are, you can go to church online, you can You can go to pop concerts online. You can do a lot of things online. Some of those will have legs, some won't. So, yeah. So the adaptation of technology, again, goes to my previous point that we're at the early phases of what these things are going to do. And the third comment about coming into presence. Well, I'm really fascinated by the fact that when I get up in the morning, the first thing I do is use a finger, really, to engage with an interface. And that might be, you know, a radio or probably my phone. And I then go and make a cup of coffee with an interface. The toaster's got buttons. Then I get in the car, there's buttons everywhere. We live in an age of interfaces, and those interfaces are designed to project onto us functionality and conceal from us complexity. And that's why some people say they're disengaging, because you don't, apart from some examples like Raspberry Pi, which is about getting underneath the interface, most technologies, and Apple are the classic example, most technologies are about concealing complexity from the user and turning you into a user. And as a user, you don't need to think. That's the whole point. In fact, you know, I think there are many structural institutions that have this same structural form. So this idea of interfacing, I think, is something that's the seeds of that idea in Heidegger, and I think this is the way in which we are engaging. This is the way the world is coming into our perception in the present age through interfaces. So what that does to human relationships and to educational context, I think, is really worth thinking carefully about, because, you know, I just think the concealments of technical interfaces and how that shifts how we operate in the world is something that we haven't really thought much about. But that's something I'd like to talk about separately, I think. So I think, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much, Lewin. We come to a close of this. And those who have more questions can just continue later on. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks a lot.